In this second part of the conversion of a Bachmann Hall class to AXS Protocab operation, we will be looking at the alterations needed to the split chassis and the need to insulate the motor terminals completely. The body is held in place by one screw located underneath the cab. As always, I work on a piece of kitchen rolled paper, so having removed the screw from the chassis, tape it down to the paper and mark where the screw comes from. We now need to remove the keeper plates that hold the axles in place, remove the two screws and unclip the plate from either end of the chassis. The wheel sets can now be removed from the chassis block, but be very careful when taking the crossheads away from the cylinder block because the piston of the crosshead vacuum pump needs care in removing it. The two halves of the split chassis can now be separated, but take care to note where the spacing washers and the nylon spacers at the foot of the chassis block are located. Separating the chassis halves exposes the motor, the body of which is prevented from turning by means of two phosphor bronze springs, which I've already removed. As can be seen, there is very little space between the motor terminals and the metal of the chassis block. On a positive note, however, the motor is towards the back of the chassis block, so the wires leading to the terminals can be taken through the chassis block and out to the LCU. A round needle file opens these two apertures to about 2 mm. Cut one of the heat shrink tubes supplied with the 0502 locomotive control unit in half. Then cut two 3 mm pieces from a piece of 2 mm tubing. Here I've used a plastic straw. The plastic tube will be used to insulate the holes of the chassis block. So taking the 9953 motor to LCU cable supplied with the 0502 locomotive control unit, firstly thread on the two plastic tubes, then the two pieces of heat shrink, and thread the bare ends of the 9953 cable into each of the motor terminals. Solder the bare ends onto the motor terminals, making sure it's a clean joint, then thread the heat shrink over the terminals, covering it completely, and using the side of the iron or another heat source, shrink the heat shrink over the cable and the motor terminals. Make sure that the plastic tubing can be pulled over the heat shrink right up to the body of the motor. You can now reassemble the entire chassis, omitting the wheels at this stage, and if you have not already installed the locomotive control unit and battery in the tender, these can be loosely connected together and tested, assuming that the locomotive control unit has already been adopted to one of the buttons on your 0201 direct controller. If all the Protocab components are located in the tender already, simply connect the plug from the motor straight onto the 9121 extension cable located underneath the tender. Now test fit the chassis into the body to make sure that the cables from the motor are free from any obstruction on the body and can pass underneath the footplate and onto the tender. The 9953 cable from the LCU to the motor, as supplied, is likely to be far too long, so we can trim this back to a more acceptable length without it being too tight between the locomotive and tender. In this case, we can reduce the length of the cable by about 45 mm. Cut the cable from the LCU to the motor as close as possible to the protruding heat shrink. Cut back about 3 mm of the heat shrink. Also cut back the insulation on the 9953 cable to expose about 3 mm of bare wire. Now trim back the rest of the 9953 cable by about 45 mm in this case. In this next operation, we're not only going to fit the end of the 9953 cable onto the stub of the cables coming from the motor, we're also going to be fitting on the 9970 noise suppression capacitor and covering the assembly with the second piece of heat shrink tubing included with the 0502 loco control unit, again cut in half, one piece for each cable. As an aside, if you've previously cut the lands off the 9601 plug charging unit, these make quite a useful little stand to hold the wires while you are tinning the ends ready for solder. Although the wires of the 9970 capacitor are in fact already pre-tinned, I find it better to add a bit more solder to it. Gently bend the two wires of the 9970 so that the remaining wires will fit at roughly the distance that the motor terminals are apart, and then solder the two wires of the 9953 cable onto these two wires. Trim the leads of the 9970 capacitor to about 8 to 10 millimeters long, and then thread a piece of heat shrink over this lead, and carefully holding it in place, solder the leads onto the leads protruding from the motor. Clamping the heat shrink to the leads will prevent the previous solder from coming undone. Trim the leads of the 9970 capacitor to about 8 to 10 millimeters long, and then thread a piece of heat shrink over this lead, and carefully holding it in place, solder the leads onto the leads protruding from the motor. Clamping the heat shrink to the leads will prevent the previous solder from coming undone. After replacing the wheel sets and being careful with the crosshead vacuum pump and the crossheads themselves, you can now charge the battery and test the entire locomotive. We do hope that this customer support video has been useful, and if you have any questions or any comments, and particularly if you have any suggestions for any future videos, do please write to us at support@protocab.com. Thank you for watching our video.